Where does Fernando Alonso fit into the 2020 Formula One driver market? That's not a straightforward question, although one door was closed to him last week when McLaren confirmed it was keeping Carlos Sainz Jr. and Lando Norris for next year. Ben Anderson and Scott Mitchell are here with me to try and work out if Alonso is a realistic option to return to the grid next year. Scott, you've been giving this a lot of thought and trying to work out what's going on and finding out perhaps some of the things that Alonso may be up to behind the scenes. Where does he fit into the 2020 picture at the moment?
I think it would have been fair for people to think that he was either massively not involved or had bought into that idea that he could come back, and therefore have been quite excited to see where he might fit in. Both sides are valid, because Alonso's own narrative of what his exit from McLaren was at the end of last year changed with the wind, basically. One moment it was, I'm just walking away because it's not competitive, but maybe I'll come back. Then the next time it was, it's retirement. He used that word a couple of times, and then it came back to, oh, it's not my plan to come back, but if there's a competitive prospect, I want to do it. So he's sort of been changing depending on his situation. And we had a bit of fun in the McLaren media session over the British Grand Prix weekend on the Saturday. We were just, Carlos Sainz and Lando Norris are going to continue for next year at McLaren. So if Alonso's coming back onto the grid, it categorically won't be with McLaren, at least not in 2020. And I don't think beyond, because they're really happy with Sainz and Norris. So just trying to get a bit of a vibe for how they've basically filled that void and why that attitude towards McLaren has changed. But in addition to what is going on with the team that obviously most recently employed Alonso in Formula One, the team that employed him before that in Formula One in Ferrari seems to be a done thing for next season, because Sebastian Vettel and Charles Leclerc have contracts. But this ongoing sort of unhappiness that Vettel has with F1 in itself, he said after Canada that it's not the F1 he grew up with. I asked him if the 2021 rules are key to him deciding whether to continue, and he said of course, he needs it to be interesting. And the performance just isn't there on track. He made another mistake at the weekend. It's impossible to think that hasn't sowed further doubt in the minds of Vettel and maybe Ferrari as well. Is he the man for the job? So that, to me, is sort of that has helped fuel the speculation of, oh well, you know, maybe there's going to be a door open there, or and how does what Mercedes does, because obviously if Fernando wants to come back with a super competitive car, then Mercedes is the pinnacle of that, isn't it? But they've obviously got, not only have they got two drivers locked in already and options for next year. Hamilton has a contract, Bottas may well extend his deal. They've also got a massive queue of drivers outside the door. So it's just been quite interesting, because even though you've had what's happened at McLaren, Alonso is just never seems to quite disappear.
The only way I can see Alonso coming back is with Ferrari next year. There are only three teams really kitted out to satisfy his competitive desires: Mercedes, Red Bull and Ferrari. Red Bull won't touch Alonso. Horner has said many times that he's not the kind of driver for them. His reputation as a disruptive influence, whether fair or not, precedes him. As Scott mentions, Mercedes have an embarrassment of riches and wouldn't need to upset their apple cart by introducing Alonso. So it can only be Ferrari, and that all depends on really the happiness of Sebastian Vettel and whether he wants to see out the final year of his deal at Ferrari.
Now let's just finally touch on McLaren very quickly. We can talk about the fact that it was the team that he last raced for. This is him in the 2019 overalls, because he tested the car earlier this year.
Look how happy he is.
Yeah, it's very true. But
Loving
in
life.
fairness, was McLaren really ever a realistic option for Alonso? Because as you've mentioned there, Ben, McLaren has sorted itself out and is on a great trajectory now, but Alonso's not going to come back to F1 even to drive the fourth fastest car on the grid.
No, exactly. I think the fact that the door, it's been difficult to establish exactly the status of the door, but certainly for next year it's closed at McLaren. They've retained their two drivers, signed them up early for 2020 to get out of the silly season speculation. McLaren have focused on their rebuilding process. They've accepted that they were not really at the level they thought they were at during the Honda era, and Alonso was tied... At last, yes, indeed. And Alonso was tied up in all of that baggage. I think the door was left open when he first stepped down, because from McLaren's point of view, there's lots of change going on. All of the technical changes hadn't quite come on stream. They didn't know how the new driver lineup was going to perform. You know, if Lando Norris had been out of his depth in Formula One, or Carlos Sainz hadn't gelled with the team properly, maybe they would have needed another option for next year. But as things have gone, McLaren have had a better season probably than they expected. You know, they are consistently the fourth fastest team now, and the two drivers are performing very well, as we can see from the fact they've been re-signed. And McLaren has accepted that it's not a team that's ready for a driver of Alonso's background. A double world champion brings expectation, extra pressure, which during this rebuilding phase they're not ready to deal with. So this is all part of just moving on from the past, and moving on from the past includes moving on from Fernando Alonso.
The problem that Alonso's got is that his best option was McLaren, where he seemed to have quite a lot of say in the team, and seemed to, if it was basically what Fernando wants, Fernando gets. And now, even if he was fairly convinced that McLaren would make a similar step for next year that they were going to make that they did make for this season, or maybe even for 2021, I just don't see him forcing his way back in there because of everything Ben said about establishing for the future. So if he's lost his best option, where else do you look? I agree with Ben that Ferrari seems to be the only place that's potentially viable for him. What I think is really going to happen is Alonso is just going to fade more and more into trying to do other bits and bobs. The problem that he's got now, I think, is that he's lost that appeal of contemporary McLaren Formula One driver, or active two-time world champion Formula One driver, going and doing other stuff. Now what is he now? He doesn't have a full-time WEC programme. He's still McLaren ambassador, but he's not going to do anything on track with them. Didn't even make the start of the Indy 500 this season, part of that failed qualification attempt. So, not saying for a minute, and I don't say this to offend you, not saying he's descended into Jacques Villeneuve territory of ex-F1 driver, just driving whatever he can get his hands on. But he's already said he won't do a full season of IndyCar around a 500 bid. So, and his options are limited there in the same way that he can't come back to F1 with Red Bull because he's burned his bridges at Honda. So, feels like Alonso's gone from this guy who could have come back to F1 if he wanted and had this embarrassment of non-F1 riches, as now sort of starting that slow descent into a driver who is going to have to start and try to find himself outside of F1.
I wouldn't rule out that Ferrari option though for 2021, because all bets are off then, loads of contracts are up, Vettel's included, Hamilton's obviously. The management has changed a lot since Alonso left that team, slightly acrimoniously, so perhaps he could feel that, you know, that environment would be much better for him now, and he has unfinished business. He didn't win his world title with Ferrari. Maybe he could add that third crown if he went back, and he certainly would be good enough. He's not past his prime yet as a driver, but the longer he does stay out, the less his chances of a successful return are.
Well, he went back to Renault and he went back to McLaren, so why not go back to Ferrari as well and complete the set?